infinitely subtle, is rarely met, even in 100,000 million kalpas. Now we see it, hear it, receive and maintain it. May we completely realize the Tathagata's true meaning.
We're very privileged this morning to have a speaker, Venerable Ajahn Amaro, who is the co-abbot of Abhayagiri Monastery in Redwood Valley up in Mendocino County. He comes from a very ancient tradition of forest-dwelling monks in Southeast Asia. And he was ordained there, I think, 20 years ago, by one of the greatest teachers of our time, who was Venerable Ajahn Chah. This was in Thailand. And he's originally English, so after being there for a number of years, he returned to England, where he, I believe, studied with Ajahn Sumedho, and who was an American. So we've got a cross-cultural fertilization going here, because now he has come to America and begun the monastery in Mendocino County. I want to make one little comment about the name of the monastery, which I think is wonderful. It means fearlessness, or without fear, mountain. And that rang a bell for me, because in our tradition, the paramita, or the perfection of giving, danya, the highest form of giving is fearlessness. So we're all on the same track. Thank you.
Should I begin? Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang Dhammang Sanghang Namasami. Well, I am honored to be here, very glad to be here. I've met Kwong Roshi, I think the first time in 1993, and he invited me to come and visit when I was next in California, so I failed miserably. Since I've been coming and going frequently in recent years, and actually settled here 2 years ago when we opened up Abhayagiri Monastery. And so I do frequent journeys up and down Highway 101, and I often think, I must go and visit Sonoma Mountain one day. So I'm very glad that this occasion has been brought about. As it was said in the introduction by David, word perfect introduction. So got all the facts straight. That indeed the lineage that I come from is a forest monastic lineage, and sometimes, particularly in the West, it seems like a strange it's an unusual format, or forest monk. What is that? They envisage you out there with your robes and your chainsaw, or ferns in what remains of your hair. But it's one of the elements of this style of life is that it's a style of practice that has come from the very time of the Buddha. It's the way the Buddha lived, and that all through the years, even though very quickly Buddhist centers and monasteries became urbanized and became established around the major population centers and cities, there was always a proportion of people who chose to live off in the forests and the mountains, and to be away from the immediate bustle of and the clamour of the city and village life. So there have always been forest monasteries. In the very earliest years, that's all there were, and the Buddha lived most of his life travelling and staying within the wild forested areas of northeastern India. My own teachers, Ajahn Chah and his teacher Ajahn Man, and those others of the same lineage that I've learned from, a phrase that they were frequently heard to say, very fond of saying, was that the Buddha was born in a forest, was enlightened in a forest, taught in the forest, and passed away in the forest. So we have a very definite theme. And
what's the theme?
The Buddha.
I missed it. You said it was the Buddha. I thought it was the forest.
So now, this isn't just because no one wanted to build him build up a monastery for him. And there were monasteries created in the time of the Buddha, but there is an obvious reason why places like this, Sonoma Mountain Zen Center and our monastery, Abhayagiri, and other places, are established in quiet rural settings, because this is so conducive, so supportive to direct spiritual practice. Now, obviously, on an ideal level, one can be enlightened, on the freeway, or in the city on Wall Street. These things are possible, but the Buddha was also a great pragmatist, as well as being a visionary, and he recognized that when we stumble in off the street with our full supply of greed, hatred, and delusion, that we need a bit of backup to get us through our difficulties, and to get to the other side of suffering, so that the environment of the forest, the environment of wild places, rural living, is the most helpful in that way. And even when one no longer requires it, it's interesting that even though the Buddha was totally enlightened, absolutely incapable of suffering, still, even to the end of his life, that's where he chose to live, in the wilds, in the remote mountain forest areas, because he found that environment delightful. It's pleasing. It's light on the heart. It weighs lightly upon us. So I'm not trying to get too dualistic here, but just to point out, or to reflect on what is that quality of being out in the wilds, in the country, that is so appealing or so refreshing to us. And I think what it is that it gives us a contrast to our habitual human conditioned constructions, the creations of human thought, human minds. Not because there's anything intrinsically wrong or bad with them, but because the problem that we experience in life is our compulsive adherence to the human condition, our thoughts, our feelings, our bodies, the people around us, our families. We all have our own list. And so, not saying there's anything wrong with that, but just because we experience difficulty, frustration, and stress in life because of the habitual identification with all those elements. So to be in a wild place, to be in the country, to be away from things that have been put together by human hands, then that gives us a contrast, an alternative to being surrounded by everything put together through the human mind, through the human consciousness, everything around us, basically encouraging us to perform as a human being. When you're in the country, in the forest, then you don't have to be anybody. Like when you're walking down the path, you don't have for the squirrels and the oak trees, you don't have to be an interesting personality. Your qualifications don't count for much. Your midlife crisis has no value to a robin. It doesn't mean anything. And when we are able to have an environment where we don't have to perform as a person, then we experience this quality of relief, because we're at that moment we're unable to get that kind of compulsive identification and entrapment that we feel with being a person, being young, being old, being clever, being stupid, being a success, being a failure, etc., etc., etc. We can see that for what it is, rather than when we're around other people, around our families, around our work, and that everyone is expecting us to be someone, to be a woman, to be a man, to be a particular profession, to have interesting things to say, to have opinions about everything.
Yeah, right.
When someone says, "Well, what do you think about Bill Clinton?"
Oh, yeah.
You can't say, "I don't think about Bill Clinton."
Yeah.
Well, you could try it, but you won't get very far. It's when you walk through a forest, and the oak trees are not saying, what are your feelings about the state of the stock market? What are your feelings about the proposition 113? Even though those things have their own place, to be able to just step back and to see it all in its true perspective is crucial to our cultivation and well-being. Also, a phrase that Ajahn Chah was very fond of quoting is a conversation that took place between the Buddha and a monk called Vakkali, who was very ill and was dying. And then the Buddha went to visit him in his hut on the slopes of Isigili. And so when the Buddha arrived, then Vakkali was trying to get up off his sick bed and pay his respects, and the Buddha said, don't get up, just lie where you are, it's fine. And Vakkali said, and the Buddha said, how are you, Vakkali? He said, I've been really miserable. And even though he was an arahant, he said, so why are you unhappy? And he said, well, because it's been so long since I've been able to come and visit you. I've been stuck here with this illness for weeks and weeks, and I haven't been able to visit and pay my respects to you. And the Buddha said, what use is it to observe this filthy body, Vakkali? One who sees the Dhamma sees the Buddha. One who sees the Buddha sees the Dhamma. And then he gives this very interesting teaching where he said, even if someone were to hang on to the edge of my robe and follow me wherever I went for 20 years, if their heart was still filled with greed, hatred and delusion, it would be as if they were hundreds of leagues away. But if someone is off far away in a different country, but yet their heart is free from greed, hatred and delusion, then it's as if they are sitting face to face with the Tathagata. One who sees the Buddha sees the Dhamma, one who sees the Dhamma sees the Buddha. So Ajahn Chah used to quote this very, very frequently and bring this home, as this is a kind of if you're looking for the Buddha somewhere else, if you're looking for the Buddha in a person, if you're looking for the Buddha outside your own nature, you're looking in the wrong place. And that by seeing the Dhamma, by seeing the truth of things, by seeing nature, if you like, the word nature is probably one of the best translations for the word Dhamma. When you really see the true nature of things, then that's as if you are face to face with the Buddha. There is the presence of the Buddha is right there. Your own Buddha nature is brought into manifestation at that time. So one of the aspects of living in the forest, being in the country, is that being with nature, and that being a reflection for us. One who sees the Dhamma, one who sees nature, one who truly understands that, encompasses that, then they see the Buddha. Then the Buddha mind, that pure, knowing, wise quality of our own being, is manifest, is clear, can operate within us. Also, the Buddha said, one who sees the Dhamma, or one who sees the Dhamma sees dependent origination. One who sees dependent origination sees the Dhamma. And I imagine that many of you are familiar with this concept, dependent origination. But this is what the Buddha. This was the insight that the Buddha had on the night of enlightenment, at least from the Theravada perspective. This is what the Buddha was reflecting on, which is the chain of causation of how the experience of incompleteness, insecurity, dukkha, suffering comes into existence. And he contemplated and reflected how that arises from from ignorance originally, and from the existence of a mind and body interfacing with the world through the sense organs, and how feeling conditions, desire conditions, attachment conditions, becoming conditions, birth, aging, death, and sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair, which is a brief synopsis. But anyway, during the night of his enlightenment, he kind of began to trace this backwards and forwards, until by the end of the night he was absolutely clear, and this is exactly how there is the causation of suffering, and also how it stops being created, how when there's no ignorance, then there is no cause for suffering, for dukkha, for insecurity. So that recognizing that process is to see the Dhamma, is to see truth. So also in the same way, when we're in natural surroundings, when we are able to let go of our identification with the body, with the personality, then we start to also be open to that flow of causation, to understand how dukkha arises from nothing, and how it ceases and goes back into nothing. Now, one of the things that's always striking to me when I visit Zen centers is the recitation of the Heart Sutra. And in this you have a kind of truncated version of the dependent origination. It says, no ignorance and so forth unto no aging and death. Some of you might not realize there's actually like another 10 steps in between those two. But probably Roshi has explained all this hundreds of times. But it's very interesting how the Heart Sutra is structured, in saying, there is no eye, no ear, no tongue, no body, no mind, no body, no feelings, no perceptions, mental formations, consciousness. That it's going through all the basic categories whereby the Buddha described the teachings of the five skandhas: form, feeling, perception, mental formations, consciousness, through the 6 senses, six senses: eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, mind. Through the dependent origination, through the Four Noble Truths, and each one saying, because of Prajna Paramita, we see that these are, there is none of these. And sometimes it's rather like that when we meet Christians. Sometimes you get hit with the, well, Jesus said, "I am the way and the truth and the life." What do you think about that? But sometimes when you come to Mahayana or Zen Buddhist centers and monasteries, then people read something like the Heart Sutra and think, well, this obviously is shooting a big hole through the Theravada system. Like, saying there's no suffering, no origin of suffering, no cessation and no way. Don't you find that a little bit insulting? Or doesn't that kind of ruin your program a little bit? Well, similarly, I was at a conference yesterday, actually, on harm reduction. They're trying to get a needle exchange program established in Mendocino County for intravenous drug users, non-hospital based intravenous drug users. And so they had a whole gathering of many different people, and they asked me to give a talk to finish the day. And one of the questions that was asked was, how do you regard the apparent conflict between Buddhism and Christianity? And so I was talking about this verse, when Jesus says, "I am the way and the truth and the life." From a literalist point of view, obviously that doesn't do Buddhism much credit. It says, well, this Jesus is obviously the number one and everybody else is wrong. But if you look at it from a contemplative point of view, then if you say, well, if Jesus is saying, "I am the way and the truth and the life," if you start off from your experience of the way, of truth, of life, and looking from your own direct knowledge, what do I know to be the way? What do I know to be the truth? What do I know to be real life? Then taking that, having faith in that knowledge, then it's simply a matter of saying, well, Jesus is just saying, "I am that." So that when he uses the word "I am," it's a much bigger "I am" than Jesus the carpenter from Nazareth. It's a universal "I am." It's the Buddha mind, if you like. So similarly, when reading something like the Heart Sutra and seeing this, there is no suffering, no origin of suffering, no cessation and no way, and so forth, that this is not in any way a negation of the Theravada perspective at all, even though a huge emphasis is put on the Four Noble Truths. The Buddha said, it is through not understanding four things that both you and I have travelled and trudged through this long round, the long round of samsara, of endless cycle of rebirths. And the four things are dukkha, suffering, the origin of suffering, cessation of suffering, and the way leading to the cessation of suffering. So this is very much the kind of center, the epicenter of Theravada teaching. But it's also important to recognize that they're noble truths, Arya Satya, they're not ultimate truths. So sometimes people will say, oh, that the Buddha said that everything is suffering. That's not true. They're noble truths, not absolute truths, which is to say that if we pick up this object, this structure, and we use it in the right way, then it's noble because it's a conditioned and relative truth, but it will take us to the realization of that which is absolute, that which is transcendent, that which is beyond the relative. And so it's a noble truth, it's not an absolute truth. So my own teachers have been heard frequently to say things like, there is no suffering. We only have to, what we're ending is the illusion that there is suffering. That's what's being stopped. But in the absolute reality, in absolute truth, there isn't any dukkha. It's just that because of our state of ignorance, when ignorance is there, we seem to be suffering. That's the problem. But on the absolute level, there is no suffering. There's no origin of suffering, there's no cessation, there's no way. And so something like the Heart Sutra is talking directly at It's addressing that absolute level of insight. This is, I must also put a footnote that this is my interpretation, so I might be crossing all kinds of boundaries into heresy in terms of Zen practice. But I'm sure Kwang Roshi is so big-hearted he will accommodate even the most gross insults to the Zen approach. But as far as my understanding and discussions with other people out of these traditions is, this is very much how it's looked at. So to me, it's very crucial. Actually, if you don't have that ultimate perspective, then your understanding of dependent origination and the Four Noble Truths is going to be incomplete. And that you are using these are crucial insights to develop and to cultivate. But if we take them to be literally true, and take them in a narrow way, then we find our own practice heavily hindered. That it only works if we can see that this is a relative truth. If we take the idea there is suffering as an absolute truth, then why even bother? If that's what we are, then there will be no point in any kind of spiritual practice at all. Now, another element that you also get within Mahayana tradition, and we have this absolutely splendid Guan Yin, Kanzeon image here. This is quite awe-inspiring, beautiful. Which again, people often look at Theravada practice, or the way it gets described so historically in the Mahayana sutras that grew up at the beginning of the Mahayana movement, say the Vimalakirti Sutra or the Lotus Sutra, where people like Sariputra become the sort of fall guys for
the what?
The fall guy. The fall guy.
Oh, I see.
The kind of the brunt of the joke.
Yeah. Okay.
So like in the Vimalakirti Sutra, Sariputra, comes into this house and Vimalakirti has made all the furniture disappear to symbolize emptiness, and Sariputra thinks, well, where are all the bodhisattvas and the arahants going to sit down? And then Vimalakirti says, Venerable Sariputra, did you come here for the Dhamma or did you come here for a chair? And over again, Sariputra has these kind of small-minded comments. And he's looking at the sun and saying, well, this conversation is going on for a long time between the bodhisattvas and Vimalakirti. Don't they know that noon is coming? I hope they're going to stop in time for us to eat.
Yeah.
And then Vimalakirti kind of pauses and says, Venerable Sariputra, did you come here for the Dhamma or did you come here for something to eat?
Yeah.
So there's the Theravada school often gets put into this role of being kind of in a contradistinction to the Bodhisattva path. And that they say, well, choosing to being Arahant is a kind of narrow-minded approach, and that the Bodhisattva is the kind of grand and cosmic. But again, it's really within the scope of the practice of Theravada that is equally implied. In fact, every great master I've known from the Theravada lineage, which is that their entire life, every waking hour is spent helping people. This is quite staggering. It means almost like the older that they get, the more hours they're ready to put in. And so there's and in a completely unbegrudging way, it's very much the heart is given totally over to the service of our other beings. But it's interesting how, just as the Heart Sutra is an extension of the Four Noble Truths into the into the absolute or ultimate perspective, the Bodhisattva vows are the extension of the Four Noble Truths into the social plane. So they are explicitly derived from the Four Noble Truths. But rather than I am experiencing suffering, but all beings are suffering. Living beings are numberless. I vow to save them all. Rather than there's me. I vow to save me as a limited scope. So then, secondly, afflictions are limitless. I vow to cut them all off. there is the cause of dukkha. There's affliction, self-centered desire is the cause. Then the third and the fourth are the opposite way round. So in the Bodhisattva vows you have the Dhamma doors are endless. I vow to enter them all, which is the path, the Eightfold Path, in the Four Noble Truths. And then the third Noble Truth, which is there is a cessation of suffering in the Bodhisattva way. Bodhisattva vows is the Buddha's way is unsurpassed. I vow to accomplish it. So these are taking these four basic principles and extending them beyond the scope of an individual life into the universal sphere. But actually within Theravada practice as well, if you're only applying those truths within the scope of this one little life, you are grossly limiting the power and relevance of the teaching, and it cannot really bring about liberation. There's no way that you can that there can be true liberation without that encompassing of all beings, and the recognition of Dhamma as being not just the reality of your own life, but the reality of all life. And realizing the Dhamma, realizing the truth of your life, is realizing the truth of the life of everything else. So that in this way, that there is, I'm just sort of putting some things out for people to reflect on. I'm not trying to make a sort of defense of Theravada Buddhism, but just to kind of just to bring up these themes so that it helps to clarify the tremendous compatibility that there is between Buddhist traditions. If you get past the words to the practical application of them, and the practice as it is experienced and lived, and that it's one of the experiences I've had of that meeting more and more people from different traditions is finding how deep and how true those kind of comparisons are, and that even like the way that the robes are sewn, and that Kwong Roshi, his robes are exactly, his robes have the same paddy field pattern as mine do,
Yeah.
exactly the same.
Yeah.
And so that, and material is slightly different. If you consider after 2,500 years,
that's amazing.
It's pretty remarkable for a form like that to hold itself together. Actually, I was also going to mention that the very first Buddhist book that I read was Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind. So I have a lot to thank Suzuki Roshi for. And the reason why it was the first Buddhist book I read, when I stumbled into a monastery in northeast Thailand 20 years ago, I was being shown around the monastery in this, and I asked this French monk who was there, well, is there something I can read, or I have never read anything on Buddhism at all, so where should I start? And he said, well, this is the Theravada scripture. It is terribly boring. This is, why don't you read this? This is pretty much the same. And so he gave me a copy of Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind, because it was a lot more readable and interesting. So that was the first Buddhist book I ever read. So, I just got a few pages into it, and I thought, well, there it is. Now, it's the last thing I thought I might mention, or just put out, and we'll have some time for some questions, is that, unless one, so you have Kanzeon standing in front of us, and this is Manjushri on the line behind.
Yes.
And that these are very much like you have the Four Noble Truths, which is extended out into the sphere of Kanzeon and the Bodhisattva vows and the compassion for all beings, and you have extending back into emptiness of the Heart Sutra of Manjushri. And if we don't have both those elements, where there's an absolutely clear and complete realization of this is totally and utterly empty, then we're lost. And if we don't have the clear and absolutely valid realization that everything matters, everything, every dust mote matters, then we've lost it. And that this phrase that you have on your verse, may we completely realize the Tathagata's true meaning. I have a pet theory about the word Tathagata. In a famous, well, not terribly famous, slightly famous place in one of D.T. Suzuki's books, he says, "The word Tathagata is utterly untranslatable. It is inconceivable in meaning. There is nothing that can be said about it." And then for the next 14 pages,
Yeah, right. Yeah.
he goes on to explain it. But the way I like to understand it is it's composed of two elements. The first part, tat or tata, which means such or thus, and the second part, which is gata or agata, which means, well, the word gata means gone, and the prefix of the letter a means the opposite, so it means to come. So agata means to come, gata means to go. So, does the word mean thus gone or thus come? Completely here, completely immanent, present, and absolutely contiguous with the phenomenal? Or does it mean gone to suchness, gone to thusness, completely, utterly beyond, without any trace of involvement or attachment? And this is etymologists and Buddhologists for centuries and centuries have been wrestling over what did the Buddha really, really, really mean. But the Buddha actually coined this word himself. It doesn't appear anywhere, as far as I know, in any Sanskrit literature before then. And the Buddha was very fond of word plays and ambiguity and irony. There's a lot of humor. It's not so apparent in Mahayana scriptures, as far as I've read. But in the Theravada canon, there's a lot of kind of subtle humor in there, and a lot of wordplay. And I'm virtually certain that the Buddha meant it to have a double meaning, that it both means utterly here and utterly gone, and that it's a both and, both here and gone. And this is also symbolized by the Night of Enlightenment, where you don't have a earth-touching Buddha. No Buddha. If you're familiar with the Buddha images or tankas where the Buddha touches the ground, that right hand reaches down to touch the earth. Well, this is, mythologically, this is an extremely significant moment. It's also interesting that throughout the Buddhist world, that's the most common of all Buddha images in virtually every Buddhist country. And that's the moment of enlightenment, is where the Buddha touches the earth. And what's happened in the story is that the Buddha has had the liberating insight. He's been surrounded by the army of Mara, and there's the forces of fear, the forces of desire, and the forces of responsibility, all kind of belaboring him. He's had the insight into absolute truth, and he's completely free from delusion. But Mara's army won't retreat. And Mara is still saying to him, "What right do you have to say that you're enlightened? You know, you walked out on your wife and kid. You gave up your ascetic practices. You're a failed father, and you're a failed yogi. And now you're trying to tell everyone that you're the big enchilada. You know, who do you think you're kidding?" And then the Buddha then says, "I have realized perfect and complete enlightenment. I have every right to sit at the spot, and the perfections are complete. All of the paramitas are complete." And then Mara says to him, "Well, my perfections are complete too. I've got witnesses." And all his armies say, "Yes, yes." And then the Buddha then the reason why he touches the earth, he calls the earth goddess, Mother Earth, Mea Torani, to be his witness. And she comes forth, and the earth quakes, and she says, "This is my own true son, who has every right to sit at the immovable spot and to proclaim perfect and complete enlightenment." And then from her hair she produces this river and washes away all the armies of Mara, and then they're carried off, and they then come back bearing gifts and offerings and asking for forgiveness. But it's interesting to me that, well, what symbolically you have there is, while the Buddha's insight is complete, if it's just an internal subjective insight, like that's not connected to our body, our personality, the world around us, then Mara's army is still there saying, "Who do you think you are?" The transcendence is not complete. It's only when we have the humility to recognize that, yes, everything is empty, but yes, there's also this body, and I have parents in England, and I have a social security number, and I need to eat and breathe and shoes for my feet. There is that, when there's the humility to acknowledge the limitation, calling the earth to witness. Only when that connection is made, then the earth responds, the world responds, and then the armies of Mara are utterly defeated. So if we're trying to make our enlightenment, our liberation, just an internal space that is disconnected from our caring and responsibility for the world around us, then Mara's still going to be there, and as soon as you wobble, boom, in he comes, game over. And we foul up in grand terms. The material world comes back to bring its message to us. But when there is that acknowledgement, that full-hearted engagement and realization of belonging to the universe, and then it's a weird irony that by completely and utterly letting go, then we experience and know that sense of belonging. And it's like, because of the quality of emptiness is realized, then nothing is going to get crowded by allowing the entire universe in. Right? So that we can afford to be totally accommodating and accepting, and allow ourselves to realize our relatedness to all things. So, I will finish there and open things up for some questions. Yes.
With regard to whether we're in the present in the translation that we have of the Eightfold Path, it's always rendered as this is right contemplation. But the word exact is I sense that the word right
isn't right.
Not the correct translation, and I'd like to know what the word is in Sanskrit or Pali, and how it can be understood in terms of wordplay.
Well, the word in Pali is Samma, S-A-M-M-A, and it's right is not a very good translation. In sort of classical usage, it works, but in our modern day usage, it gives a very distorted impression. What Samma actually means is something like balanced or even. So it's or perfect. Like some people translate it as perfect view, perfect understanding, perfect concentration, and perfect not meaning 100%, but appropriate. So it's like the concentration which is completely balanced, or that is the view which is completely balanced. Because the word right is so much associated with having a set of opinions. Like Ajahn Amaro was very fond of pointing out that right view is not the same as righteous views. That you can be full of your own rightness, but be completely out of accord with the people around you. So I don't know so much in that there's a wordplay involved in that, but the meaning is much more to do with a quality of attunement of that aspect of the path to the circumstances. So like right concentration, samma samadhi, is like the concentration appropriate to the task in hand, the situation that you need to be in. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
You mentioned the verse in the Bible, I am the way, the truth, and the life. But I think the next line after that, isn't it, no one comes to the Father but by me? Mm-hmm. So would you continue that explanation and come to that spiritual part of the...
Yeah, no problem. Well, what is Jesus... I mean, I was at a conference with the Dalai Lama where he was giving comments